We'll get going. I got the graveyard shift today, 3:15 on Saturday. So thanks everybody for coming. We're going to try and I'm going to try not to talk too much. I'm here because I want to have some discussions and ask some questions, and hopefully we can do some talking together. Really quickly, who I am. My background is I spent a long time working in the field of online civic engagement. I worked with an organization called edemocracy.org, did some of my own work with polytalk.org. Never made very much money doing all of this work. A lot of, my goals were about getting people involved in politics, civic engagement. It just doesn't pay well, good figure. In 2010, I ran out on this crazy adventure going to a Chinese restaurant. That didn't go so well, and I ended up in the Drupal community. I was very interested in open source. I knew some people in the community, was intrigued by it. I came here, I've been working in the Drupal community for the last 6 years. I own and run a small Drupal shop in the Twin Cities called Triplo. I'm hoping to do more like civic engagement kind of things with Triplo in the future. We haven't had a chance to do a lot of that yet, but we're working on it. My qualifications for talking about this particular topic, I don't know, maybe that. I've been practicing. So, no.
Metaphor.
The talk, why talk about this topic? It was, after the election. This isn't going to be a lot about politics in this sense, but I can't deny the fact that it was after the election. I'm thinking about where my work, what I'm doing in the world, how I'm living my values in terms of my work, and started thinking about that, and certainly in terms of my community involvement. For the purposes of our discussion today, though, I'm not really talking about using Drupal to elect candidates or campaigns necessarily. We can talk about that, or some of you want to talk about that. That would be great. But I have a broader interest in this, and just how we use Drupal to make the world a better place. So this definition, I don't know if it's the best definition, but I liked it because it suited my needs. Any act which is intended to have an effect on the established order. A lot of you probably know Matthew Tift from the Twin Cities. He and I have been talking for a while about how to better use Drupal camps and Drupal events to address some of the values of doing good and those kinds of things that we talk about in the Drupal community. Matthew has a podcast, Hacking Culture, where he talks a lot about free software and the public good. It's been really helpful for me as somebody who hasn't been in the free software movement for a long time. I've been kind of on the periphery, and it's this, recently I've been just spending time, and part of why I'm here today, again, is these are topics I wanted to explore, and I wanted to talk to people, I wanted to get their feedback, and to talk more about them. Matthew's somebody who's been putting a lot of thought into it. He wrote the title for this really came from a blog post he wrote right after the election, where he called Drupal as a political act, which really the point of what he was talking about is Drupal as a force for good, and how we're using Drupal, and the Drupal community is using Drupal for good. For those just coming in, I'm doing a short presentation really to kind of set the stage, and then I'm going to try and engage you folks in a talk. Through my career, I have used a lot of different sort of open source tools. The Drupal community is the only Drupal community I've been really involved in. I did have the opportunity once. Is Group Server up there? I'm not sure if I did. In my e-democracy days, I had the opportunity to actually help fund the release of what had been a proprietary system as an open source project. I was involved in that as a part of a team, not in the code end, but we basically we were doing some online civic engagement work with the British government, setting up some forums in different British cities, and they wanted this to be expandable. And they wanted to be using a platform that was open source, not a closed source tool. And the tool that we knew that most used it was a tool down in Australia, or New Zealand, that was built. But they wanted to go open source, but they needed some funding to go there, and we were able to provide them some funding to put the work in to release their project as open source. So I had those kinds of experiences, but that's not the same as really being involved in the community, certainly being involved in the free software movement. So anyways, I've sometimes taken it for granted, a lot of these different tools that I've used over the years, and not, I don't think enough about them. And one of my concerns has been that, I've been coming to Drupal events now for 4 or 5 years, and there's a lot of talk about, we're an open source project, there's a lot of talk about contributing to Drupal, but I've been sort of yearning for a little bit like the bigger picture. Larry's somebody who talks about that a lot. Certainly the PHP and Drupal community. In fact, I remember talking to you a couple years ago and asking you specifically about resources on comparing various open source communities. What can we learn from other communities? It's a little bit of a distinction. How many people here are really familiar with the free software movement, have been involved? Consider yourself sort of, okay. I want to just talk, I don't think we talk much about the values behind that, and I'm not here to promote a particular idea or anything, but I want to just sort of quickly go over some of the ideas about the free software movement and how we got to where we are today, and I'm going to do this really kind of quickly. Matthew, every time I bring this up, reminds me that open source and free software are different, right? They're conceptually not the same. It's something that I wouldn't think about. I think, how many people know the difference between open source and free software? About half the audience. At the most basic level, open source is a development methodology. Free software is really a social movement. This guy, some people might be familiar with, Richard Stallman, is often considered to be one of the sort of founders of the movement. Free software existed before him. He certainly hasn't been the only guy doing it, but he's one of the strongest advocates for the free software movement, right? And what exactly is the free software movement compared to what we talk about today? One of the things Richard says a lot, it's cliche, but I just wanted to use it. Free software is more about free speech than free beer. I've been going back and looking at some of the writings, and in the free software movement, they refer to free software as a human right, not just an economical way to deliver software. They talk in the free software movement about the 4 freedoms in software, some of which are pretty obvious to us. Most of them are, in fact. Drupal, I think, adheres to a lot of these: the freedom to run the programs as you wish, the freedoms to study the programs and change them, freedom to redistribute copies to your neighbor, and the freedom to distribute modified versions so you can distribute. All of these things are possible with Drupal. Then in about 1998, a group of folks got together and coined the term open source initiative. I guess this was around the time, I think, Netscape. Yeah, it was, Netscape, wasn't it, about when they went public, the browser? They released it as open source. There was some momentum growing. A lot of people in the free software movement were interested in involving more corporate businesses, getting businesses involved in the community, and they wanted to kind of separate themselves from the ideological values of the free software movement and make it more welcoming to businesses and focus instead on the pragmatic sort of business case grounds. The kinds of things we talk a lot about today in the Drupal community. Open source produces better software, more secure software, those kinds of arguments. Since then, and of interest to me, is one of the reasons I got involved in the Drupal community is coming out of civic engagement. This whole idea of projects like Drupal getting built distributively by volunteers in a large open source community was very intriguing to me. It seemed a little bit revolutionary to me. I didn't quite understand it. I didn't quite get how it worked, and I couldn't help but wonder, what is going on? How do these kinds of communities work, and what kind of lessons might I learn from an open source community towards, say, solving other problems in society? I don't know. I mean, I've been here a few years, and I'm not sure that we've solved all the problems, but I've certainly learned some things. a lot of people are trying to take the ideas of open source to other things. There's a lot of other open movements now, open government, open data, and there's a lot of interchangeability around these ideas. And I guess overall what I'm just trying to get at is that this idea, I'm not quite comfortable with Richard Stallman's idea of free software in terms of like all commercial software is bad. I'm not prepared to go that far. On the other hand, I get very nervous about losing those values altogether. To me, it seems like there's something in what he's talking about, and there's something inherent in the value of free software that we lose when we just talk about it being economical, when we just talk about producing better code. And I get a little bit nervous that we're losing those values. So really the next thing I'm going to do is just kind of go through some things I found. I've been doing research about Drupal, the history of Drupal, and our Drupal values. Well, actually the first thing I'm going to share is just actually over the course of this Drupal camp, I came into this Drupal camp with the idea that we don't talk enough about these ideas, and I think this is probably the Drupal camp that I've been at where there's been the most talk about these ideas. Some because of what's going on in the community right now, but a lot of it not. I mean, I think a lot of the sessions that were proposed months ago. We've had I don't know, I just feel like there's been a little bit more discussion about community, about open source, and I don't know if that's just chance, but a couple of sessions I went to this morning, Ryan Gibson was talking about Facebook Instant Articles, Google App, Apple News, and talking just a little bit about how companies like Facebook are really trying to control content. And he said, in the Drupal community, we need to be champions of the open web. I think that's something that most of us would agree on, but I sometimes wonder, so how are we champions of the open web? What can I do to be a champion of the open web? Yesterday, we were talking about Drupal diversity problem and how to solve it, and Chris said the Drupal community is about doing good. These kinds of themes come up a lot. Matthew Tift, who again wrote this article, Drupal is a Political Act, said, I believe, I participate in the Drupal community because I believe it represents ideals that are consistent with my own. I'm going to read parts of just a few other quotes as I went back and looked. The Drupal.org action, Drupal has a mission. Drupal believes in open source, innovation, globalism, and collaboration. Greg Dunlap wrote an interesting article based on a keynote he gave a few years, and he said, I got involved. Actually, I want to read. It's funny because for all the time we spent talking about Drupal software, I couldn't give a shit about Drupal the software. I didn't get involved with Drupal because I wanted to build the best CMS in the world. I got involved because of the amazing people I met, what they taught me, and what I thought I could pass on to others. The history of Drupal goes back to, a lot of people talk about DeanSpace and some of the work that came out of that. I think 10 years ago, if you went to a Drupal con, some of you might have been around here back then, I wasn't. I suspect that it was a lot more nonprofits really talking about how Drupal could save the world. Jeff Robbins wrote this interesting article really talking about how we were going to save the world with Drupal. Today, we talk a lot more about how we're going to make Drupal more enterprise friendly. So, I think I'm just about done with my quotes here. This was an article I found written a couple years ago. It's understandable then that the political savvy open source community leaders saw a natural dovetail between the group and public sphere. And if users and creators could work together to create a sustainable, thriving online network around useful content, surely open source principles could be successfully incorporated into many other industries and social communities as well. For one, the open source community has become one of the foremost proponents of democracy on the internet. So I like to think about open source and free software as kind of a social movement. But I also get the commercial value. I understand that we want businesses and corporations to be involved, and I understand the balance and the trade-offs that are made in that. But basically, I'd like to hear more from you folks about where you feel Drupal is going as a force for social good, about how we can live our values through Drupal, not just in the community, but out in the world. And I'd like to, at this stage, that's really all I have for a presentation. I just wanted to set the stage. And I think there are some pretty smart people in this room with a lot of experience. And this, one of the things that really struck me as I started doing all of this is how little thought I put into like using other open source projects, except for when it's very convenient to me. What do I do to support other tools? Do I make an effort through my time in the Drupal community, right? I know people like Matthew who try very hard to use open source solutions as often as they can, and sometimes push back a little bit when we talk about using other tools. I've never really taken that attitude before, and I'm not sure I'm ready to become, to give up all my proprietary software, but I wonder if I don't need to be making a little bit more effort to support other communities and use other tools. Anybody share?
I've actually been looking into this area myself a bit recently, and one of the phrases that stuck with me is from Cory Doctorow, who gave a keynote at DrupalCon a couple of years ago, and he's repeated the same message recently, that the first moral principle of the web is if a computer receives conflicting instructions from its owner and from a third party, the owner must win. My computer should obey me, not some third party. Licensing is an incidental way of achieving that, but if you don't have that, if your tools are beholden to someone other than you, then so are you. And I very much consider myself a free software person, not an open source person in that regard. And that's, the license is just a way of enforcing that in a sense.
And can and should we be doing more in the Drupal community to promote and sort of support those ideas, or does that risk, we stepped away from those political ideas, I think, to be inclusive, right, to bring more people into the community. But I don't know. I feel like there could be more discussion about it than there is, and I'm just wondering what other people think about that. Or do we talk enough about the values of open source in the Drupal community? Anybody else? No?
We talk a lot about the value of open source. We don't talk about the values of free software.
Free software, right.
I don't say that to something to our benefit.
I don't. We talk about the value of Drupal as open source, I think. I really don't hear us, and maybe I'm not listening, and I'm talking about the broader community. I mean, there was a session yesterday about just contributing to open source projects in general, and that was like the first time I remember seeing a session that was just sort of aimed at a broader idea of open source. Am I making that up? Other people notice that? How about, I did that last week in preparation for this. We have a little unconference last week that we did in the Twin Cities, and I brought the topic and I said open source is a political act. And the first thing we did is we just kind of went around the room and I asked people who they are and what their relationship with open source is. Like, are you just a user? Are you a developer? When did you get involved? I'd be curious to hear that from you, and that might help us get a discussion going. I'll just start picking on people unless somebody wants to volunteer.
I can start. It's relevant to some degree. I started with Drupal because I was an AmeriCorps volunteer in 2006, and it was a core of like 20 or so young adults who were put into community technology centers in Twin Cities to run programs in computer labs for underserved populations. And so we were all like vaguely doing the same thing in different places, and we would meet up every couple of weeks to try to compare notes and stuff like that. And we didn't have any platform or software for like storing a repository of all the things we were learning or all the resources that we had available for each other, because we weren't making really any money except just staying afloat, and resources for the people that we were serving. So I knew a little bit about programming, and I heard a little about Drupal, and I really was intrigued by the idea of community plumbing, which used to be the tagline. And I have no idea where that went. It's somewhere in the shared history of people who are now old timers in Drupal. But but I put up a Drupal 5 site that became our repository of knowledge, and it was used for a long time. The core kept with it for a while to sort of centralize their own knowledge base and to organize their efforts. And that was really empowering for me, I thought. That was something that I felt like I wanted to keep on doing.
Well, one of the things that drew me to Drupal is I know a lot of nonprofits and people in nonprofit communities that use Drupal. I think I'm very attracted by the idea of building software that empowers organizations that are making change in the world, right? And I think about it, I don't want to say I'm worried because that sounds too strong, but I think about it as the movement of Drupal going into a direction where it's going to continue to play that role. 5 years from now, will Drupal be a powerful tool for small nonprofits, or will it have morphed into something else much more complicated? A friend of mine from the local Twin Cities Drupal community was just at a big nonprofit conference talking about Drupal, and he said, no, nonprofits aren't really using Drupal as much as they used to. That was his impression. I don't have any statistics to break that up, but I think, I feel like I've noticed I've witnessed nonprofits moving off of Drupal to WordPress just because it's easier.
Well, I think part of that too, I work with a lot of libraries, public libraries, and I think part of it is just that WordPress has developed to the point where it can now do things that in the past Drupal was really the only platform for building those things.
And I'm not saying that Drupal shouldn't get better and shouldn't solve bigger problems, and maybe WordPress, is a better tool for nonprofits. But I'm interested in the discussion, and I just would like the community to be talking more about it. I think it does in some circles get talked about some, but I'm not saying.
So, I actually chose the username nonprofit, and the reason for that is, I have a heart for these little struggling museums that have 2 volunteers that, each do 2 days, and what I found is that, the places that get it have a budget to make it happen. And the places that don't, it's very hard to convince them that they need to spend the money, even a minimal site. And so it's just a lot easier to work for corporate clients who are ready to pay. And so, I've kind of lost I don't know if I've lost my vision, but I'm not living out my vision because I like to pay the mortgage.
Sure. Anybody else want to talk about their relationship with open source? Besides Drupal, what kinds of open source software tools do people use? I think a lot of us aren't even aware of a lot of the open source tools we use, right?
Firefox.
Right. What?
Firefox.
Komodo.
I'm sorry?
Komodo.
Right. One of the things I've been thinking, I'm thinking a lot about free and open source software. One of the reasons I think maybe we don't talk as much about the values and try to promote them is that open source software seems to have some momentum, right? It seems to be, to some extent, I think it's like we don't need to justify it or defend it anymore because it's just making progress. But when I look at, I don't have in-depth knowledge of it, but when we look across outside of web development, it seems to me that web development open source is different than some other fields because the people doing web development are the people contributing right back to it, right? One of the logos I showed was for GIMP, right? Image editing open source software. I can't imagine how a community like that sustains itself when there isn't the direct economic model. I'm wondering if people use other outside of their web development. Does anybody who on here uses GIMP? A bunch of people. How about what are the LibreOffice? Isn't that the current version? I used OpenOffice at some point many years ago. I think that's changed. Is anybody using LibreOffice? A couple of people. What other tools do you use?
I think there's a lot of things where it's not necessarily the application that's in front of me that I know the name of, but that application has a lot of components within it that are open source, and that's I'm always surprised when occasionally you go to your favorite. I paid for this fancy IDE website, and then they have their page where they list all the open source projects that are, you're like, holy cow, there's like 300 of them in here. And I think that's an important thing to remember with the open source too. It's like oftentimes it's tucked behind somebody else's banner.
So is anybody still trying to convince their friends to use open source tools, or have we kind of given up on that interest?
I try to convince everybody I talk to use desktop Linux.
Yeah.
So I switched 4 years ago, and I'm like Mac and open source, that Linux, that's all I use. I've moved to Windows in 4 years.
I've been a Mac user most of my career, and really quite happy with it. And for a lot of that time, I would get a little bit of flack from some of my sort of developer friends. For the first time, I'm sort of reflecting and thinking about actually playing with Linux. I've had to as a developer now, work with Linux servers, but I've never had a Linux computer. I've never worked with Linux operating system on my laptop, and I'm thinking I should probably be doing that.
I originally got into Linux and free software back when I was an undergrad here at DePaul, in fact. And I was one of the co-founders of the school's first Linux user group. And I dual booted for a long time. And what convinced me to switch full-time from Windows to Linux was Windows 2000 Service Pack 3 and above is when they started having DRM clauses in license, which means by using the software, you were contractually permitting a third-party company to access your computer and disable stuff if they feel like it. And that's not something I could morally stand for.
Right.
And regardless of the technical quality of the software at the time, that meant, okay, my options are give third-party control over my computer without my knowledge, or and I went to the next full time. Sure. And haven't looked back. I do still have some proprietary software I use, which is not the same as commercial software. Commercial is totally okay. It's proprietary. That's not. Right. But all else equal, I'll prefer the free tool because it is fundamentally safer. It fundamentally, by design, by the structure of the relationship I have with the developer is giving up their copyright ability to control me.
Trust the motivations.
Yeah. With a proprietary piece of software, I don't know if there's a backdoor in it or not.
Right.
And if there is a backdoor, I can't get rid of it. Right. With free software, it's far less likely to have a backdoor. And if there is, anyone who finds it can report it and fix it immediately. I fundamentally trust that on a moral level more than I do a proprietary system. And that becomes a bigger issue than dealing with web software, things like even Drupal, where, okay, it's GPL, but using it over the web doesn't count as distribution, which means that anyone who's using a Drupal-based application or Drupal-based site still has that same relationship of, I have no way of verifying what they're doing with my data. I have no way of verifying what they're doing with the information I'm giving them. I don't know if there's a backdoor there. I can't look. And that's why the web services loophole was a big topic of conversation for a long time, and frankly still should be. That's where the AGPL comes in. GPL 3 and so forth are ways to combat these ways that control factor has shifted as the technology has changed. And I was for a long time an advocate, I still am an advocate of Drupal switching from GPL 2 to GPL 3 because it does provide better protections for users. It doesn't do the web services loophole, but it does provide better patent protection, provides better protection against keys and so forth. And I'll say, when I was on the board for the association, my specific goal was to sort out our licensing because at the time no one knew what the version of the GPL we were on. And so I worked with our attorneys to make it clear if we were GPL 2 and later, GPL 3 is okay. We could switch to GPL 3 if we wanted to. I still think we should. I know Dries disagrees. I know that a lot of people feel that too many corporations won't touch GPL 3 because they're cowards, frankly. But I would support going GPL 3 on Drupal precisely for those reasons, for the modernized protections for developers and users against inappropriate means of control.
I wonder at the average Drupal camp, how many attendees even understand the implications of the Drupal license.
And
right?
the fact that not many do is a problem we should solve.
Right. And then, I mean, I didn't. Right? I've been doing a lot of research, and it's like I could not have described what GPL2 was to you 3 months ago. I have vague ideas about what open source licenses do, but I didn't really fully understand the difference. I had it last week. I had a slide. How many people understand the difference between the basic level, the difference between the GPL license and what would a MIT license be? How many people understand that? A couple people.
I couldn't explain it out loud.
So let me try and correct me if I'm wrong. I think one of the biggest differences between the GPL license, my understanding, is this ability, or the copyleft concept, that you anything that anybody creates with Drupal under the GPL license must be, any product that comes out of that must also be released with the GPL license. You can't, with some licenses, you can work on an open source product and then release it with a more restrictive license, your final work. With a GPL license, I think the strongest thing is you can't do that. So any products that come out of our work in the Drupal community must continue to be licensed with that same. Is that kind of the main thing?
Really, the only difference comes down at distribution time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you give me a piece of code under MIT or you give me a piece of code under GPL, my ability to use it for myself is identical.
Mm-hmm.
The difference is if I then take that code or modify a version of the code and give it to her under GPL, I have to give it to her under GPL so that she has the same rights to pass on.
Right.
With MIT, I can give it to her under MIT, I can give it to her under BSD, I can give it to her on condition that she gives me her firstborn child. All of those are legal for me to do to her. So, a lot of people talk about, GPL is less free than the MIT license or the BSD license. The freedom that MIT or BSD gives you that GPL doesn't is the freedom to take away someone else's freedom.
Right.
In case it's not obvious, I was working on a talk on this topic myself recently and have very strong opinions. Surprise, surprise.
Right.
So there are tactical reasons to use a more permissive license. Even the Free Software Foundation will do that. But when people talk about the greater freedom that BSD or MIT give you, the permissive license give you, the freedom you have is the freedom to take away someone else's. That's fundamentally what it comes down to. And that's why I very much like that Drupal is full copyleft GPL. Because that is a moral statement of not only do we want to share, but we don't want to be used as a tool of control.
Right. One of the things that another thing that I've been thinking more about, especially in our recent political climate, is the data privacy issues, right? And one of the things that has got me thinking more about the value of free software is, and you were just alluding to that, Larry, was that open source software gives the user ideally more control in the end over how their data is being used and stored, certainly more transparency behind the scenes in terms of what's being done with it. And I think that's becoming a bigger and bigger issue, and it's sort of like the issue with free software in general. It's something I just sort of took for granted. I've been aware of privacy issues, but sort of haven't risen to the level of concern where I really started to take action. And I'm getting to the stage where I'm getting more and more concerned about it. And I'm wondering, and I believe that free software, may be part of that solution. If we keep that in mind. But I'd like to talk more about it.
I have a big data story that's kind of freaky. So prior to 10 years ago, you owned your medical records. And so it was to the point where if you went to your doctor and your doctor referred you to a specialist, the specialist would have you sign a release before they would send the records back to your primary. That was medical ethics. Under HIPAA, they are allowed to communicate on your behalf. If they have a relationship with you as a patient, it is perfectly legal for them to, discuss your case, which kind of makes sense. So my wife is a doctor. She works for Northwestern Medicine, and she had an issue that concerned her, and she wanted an MRI. if there was a problem, and thankfully there wasn't, but if there was a problem, she didn't want her friends and colleagues to know about this. She didn't want her employer to know about it. So she went to someone outside the system, paid in cash, had the MRI, got the results, no worries. Phew. A few months later, she happened to check her record. And in her record at Northwestern were all of the scans, were the doctor's notes, the date and location of the appointment. How did they get that? So she called, and they said, well, we had a release. And she said, I didn't sign a release. I went there, so they, emailed her a picture with her name on the bottom. But if you have one signature, it's very easy to put that, big data can be good, but it can be very scary as well.
I know when I've gone to the doctor, that's their signature for the privacy form, but I'm not actually shown a privacy form. I have a little pad to sign on with no words on it.
So,
I think as architects, and Beth alluded to this in the lightning talks, that, I think we kind of have an obligation to say, what is this data going to be used for? And there's a limit to what we'll know, but it could be at least a superficial barrier.
So, one of my previous work with edemocracy.org, we created these local issues forums on a small open source software tool that we knew. Probably the biggest competitor now, right today, in trying to do the work we were doing would be Facebook, because everybody's on Facebook. And to some extent, some of my colleagues are they've tried for years to provide alternatives to Facebook for civic conversation, and they're giving up. And I'm just wondering, that bothers me. Is it too late? Has Facebook captured control of that? And if not, where does Drupal come in, or free software come in, to providing alternatives and solutions to that? Can we still do that?
It's difficult because for something like Facebook, you still have to operate in the free market in terms of generating users. And that's somewhere where the appeal to open source doesn't necessarily get you as a stable user base. I don't know that's within the scope of what we can do within the free software movement. I think that what we can do, and maybe the app scope there is, can we provide a tool that allows you to at least explore the idea? Can you use that tool? Is it empowering to you? Is it accessible? I don't know that it's necessarily accessible. You can be all of those. You can meet all of the four freedoms and still not have a product that can be used by the general public to accomplish some alternative or reasonable alternative. So I also wonder if Linux is an interesting example of that to me, because it has simultaneously, since the first time I installed a Linux distribution was 2005. In the last 12 years, it's gotten more stable and also more user-friendly simultaneously, and that's pretty great, considering that I think Drupal's been trying to do both of those things now for the same period of time, and I feel like it's probably not done a great job. I think that's part of it. I think that it, as if I were coming into Drupal in the same place that I was in 2006, I think I might skip it over at this point because of the barrier to accessibly gaining the expertise to do what I would want it to do.
I think the comparisons of Linux is an interesting one that I hadn't really thought of before, and especially that I feel like in the last few years even, desktop Linux has become accessible and viable to a point where people are installing it not just because it's free and open source, but because it's awesome or it's better than the paid alternative. And that's there's that whole huge market of people, I would guess probably the majority of people, who don't care if it's open source or not. They just want the better option, and that's why they're going to currently things like Facebook or Nextdoor or whatever for that stuff. They're like, no, but you should do it in a politically correct way.
This is an argument I had with Jeff Eaton many times. That for people who understand and care about such things, freedom is a viable argument. Freedom is an important argument. For the vast majority of the population, they don't care. You know, they don't think about freedom. They don't think about rights. They don't think about tomorrow. They think about what's easiest for me right now. I'll roll with that. And that's Facebook. That's Google. That's Windows or maybe Mac. You know, a top-down controlled proprietary system gives you an awful lot of choices you don't have to think about, so it's just easy to run with. You know, and we have, you know, you can mark this on your calendar. You know, Jeff's right. Free needs to be made easy, or it doesn't matter that it's free. Right. And that's something that the free software community has. I'm not going to say failed miserably, but close at understanding for a variety of reasons.
Was it they don't understand it, or just that it's that hard? Or do you think?
I mean, it is a hard problem. It's something that a lot of engineers don't think about because that's not the part that they find interesting. It's the culture of free software and open source and that collaborative, you know, throw patches at it until it works approach doesn't work for UX. And so we don't, as a community, know how to really deal with that, where good UX has to be top-down. Design has to be top-down, and we can't cope with that. And then the fact that centralization is easy. You know, Google Docs is a nice closed proprietary system controlled by one company who now has more data than God. But it's so easy when everyone just uses that. And the network effect there of not having to coordinate, okay, which server and which network is this document on, there's no way for a peer-to-peer system to compete with that. You know, Facebook, as the sole silo of all personal data, has a lot of practical usability advantages to it. And the trade-offs for that are horrific, but people don't think about that. They think about, oh, this is easy because everybody's on Facebook.
So we're going to wrap up. A couple of just final things. One of which, if any of you know of things going on in the open source community that I might want to be interested in looking at in terms of taking my social media dependence off of these big tools, I'd be curious of that. I've heard like references to open source solutions to social media. I understand that there may be practical concerns there in terms of whether anybody uses them or not, but I'd like to know more. Did you want to say something quick?
They use OwnCloud.
Okay.
OwnCloud, it's a Dropbox type system, self-hosted, PHP and other tools. It's AGPL3, so it's the most aggressive copyleft available. I've been running my own for about 1.5 years now. It's actually a fairly nice system.
I've been considering, in future camps like this, just waffing on open source tools and just getting together with people and talking about what tools they're using. Because, again, I'm not necessarily running across to myself, and it's good to hear what other people are using and what's working for them. Last thing I just want to mention quick, when Matthew and I first started talking about this, we're all, Les and Joe and Dan are all members of the Twin Cities community. We help with the Twin Cities Drupal camp. And I started thinking about what can we, in terms of just Drupal doing good and having an impact in the world, what more could we be doing at our camp? And we've been throwing around ideas, or I have thrown it around with a few people, like, sprint, doing, I have heard, I think at Drupal cons in the past, there have been a few sort of like hackathons on projects for social good. We've been talking about, as developers, do we want to get more involved in our community, working on projects for, some of us have went to some hackathons as a group in the past. And that's just another thing that I'm interested in talking about. We don't have time to talk about it now, but if anybody is interested in talking about that or has experience with sort of just doing community work as a Drupal community, I'd like to hear more about that. Anybody else have any last words before we wrap it up? Appreciate everybody coming so late on Saturday. I think we have closing comments downstairs, and thanks for coming to MidCamp. There is a sprint tomorrow. Let's come sprint on open source. Who's coming to sprint tomorrow? Why not? Everybody should come. My very first Drupal camp 6 years ago, I came there, I hardly knew anybody. I sat through a whole camp. Every session somebody got up and said, oh, you should come and sprint, you don't have to be a coder. It wasn't until the final session of the final day on Saturday that XJM got up and gave this impassioned plea and said, I was just totally brushing it off and said, no, anybody can come and help at a sprint. and she talked me into it at 5 o'clock on Saturday to come on a Sunday. And now it's 6 years later, and I'm still showing up at sprints. So within 6 months, I was organizing my own sprints in the Twin Cities. So I wasn't a deep coder. I came and I helped do some, issue rewrites, things like that. Go ahead.
If there's final thoughts, I'll just throw out this one other thing we can do. Talk about free software, not about open source. Refer to Drupal when we're talking to people as free software, not open source. Talk to clients and say free software, not open source. Move the terminology back onto the emphasis of freedom and independence and control rather than economic efficiency.
And I think that sort of making sure that when you're having those conversations about free software, it's also from the like freedom variation, not
What
the
it is.
not the dollar signs variation.
Yep.
You can take your business elsewhere. I can't control the aspect of it.
Everything I read about free software keeps coming back to the idea that they understand that the term free software is misleading, and they've been trying to solve that for years, but we just haven't come up with a good way other than the free beer, free speech analogy. So, thanks again for coming. Let's go.